What grade would each of you give traditional public schools in the United States today? Start with Senator Shaheen.
Well, it depends on where they are. You know, in New Hampshire, we have some really excellent schools, and if you look at our performance on standardized tests, we do better than much of the rest of the country. But we have some schools that are not doing so well either. And so I think it's hard to give one generic grade to all of the schools because, as we heard from the previous panel, you know, we've got some really exciting things going on in education and in schools around the country. But sadly, it's not happening everywhere, and that's what we need to get to. We need to make sure that excitement is happening everywhere.
I agree with that. We have schools that are doing well and would deserve a high grade, and others that are failing our students. And it, you know, as a general rule, in my state, our schools do well. Our public schools are good, and people have confidence in them. I mean, there's areas we're working on improving all the time, but Senator Shaheen's right. I mean, we have a mix. Obviously, the goal is to work to improve all of our schools and empower them, and that's something we do in Every Child Achieves. We really work to make sure that the resources and the control goes out to the states and the local school districts.
That transitions very nicely into what my second question was going to be, which is the efforts to rewrite federal education law have been going on for many years. Just this summer, both the Senate and the House have passed bills that deal with this. Both of them look at pulling control away from the federal government and putting it in the hands of the localities. But the bills are quite different and do it in different ways. Do you think it has success of passing? And what do you think is the most effective way of giving the places that are failing, that aren't doing well, the chance to succeed?
Do you want me to start that one?
You can go first on this
Sure,
one.
happy to. We really worked, from my perspective, in the Senate, and the House did too, I think, to make sure that you have local control. That the local school districts, and you know, the states and the local school districts, the school boards, really have the discretion in terms of how they utilize the federal resources they're given, and how they work their curriculum, and also how they do their testing. One of the big changes in Every Child Achieves is we still have the testing, grades 3 through 8, and a test during your high school years. But the schools really get to determine how they do the testing and then how they respond to the test results, how they respond in terms of teacher training and how they respond in terms of adjusting education and curriculum at that local school, which I would think would appeal very much to a former teacher. But for us on the Republican side, that was incredibly important. And so that was a huge, you know, that's a huge focus in the legislation, is that local control.
Well, and I think most of us would agree that No Child Left Behind didn't work the way it was anticipated to work. And what I heard from people all over New Hampshire, whether it was parents or teachers or other educators, is that it needed to be changed. And I think that's one of the things that the new Senate bill does anyway. And you know, I come from a state where we believe in local control in New Hampshire. And so I do think making sure that school districts and states can set the direction for where they want to go is important. New Hampshire is one of those states that's piloting some new ways of determining how students are doing, and making sure that they can continue those initiatives, I think, is really important, so that the federal government doesn't say this is the way you have to do it. But making sure that resources are there to support what school districts are doing and to support areas that are important to improving education, I think, is equally important, so that the focus on supporting early childhood education as part of that Every Child Achieves Act, I think, is very important. You ask about what the prospects are for actually getting something done. I think that's not clear. There are some real differences between the Senate bill, which passed with 81 votes, and the House bill. One of those that's pertinent to the STEM discussion is that the House bill eliminated the one program in the Department of Education that supported professional development for teachers in science and math. Well, I think that's not something we should be doing. And so having that debate at the conference level between the House and Senate still has to happen. Now, I do think, and John, you may have a view on this, but I think both Lamar Alexander, who chairs the Help Committee in the Senate, and Patty Murray, who's the ranking member, are both very committed to seeing that legislation pass. And so I think that bodes well for actually getting something done.
And that's the point I was going to, you actually made the point I was going to add it if you didn't. I think when you look at the conferees, particularly the chairman and ranking members, John Klein in the House, for example, and you mentioned the senators and our ranking member in the House, I'm drawing a blank there, but when you look at the conference committee, I think you've got a good group. So I'm optimistic. I think they are going to find a way to bring the two bills together and that we're going to be able to pass a final bill and get it signed by the president.
Great. Before we go to audience questions, which I'm very eager to do, I want to talk about something that is very politically interesting at the moment in education. It's the one education question that came up at the presidential debate, which is that of Common Core. Both New Hampshire and North Dakota were part of the consortia that began Common Core, have been a part of it since the beginning. What do you think of it, and what is its future?
You know, John and I served as governors together, and so we both remember that governors back in the 90s really started the discussion around how do we improve, along with educators in our states, but about how can we at the state level focus more on education, on improving what graduates know, and how do we connect that to workforce skills. And most people think Common Core is a federal mandate. Well, all of you know that it's not. It's something that the governors came up with, and it's been adopted by states based on whether they support it in the states. And so it's worked pretty well in New Hampshire. It's not something that I hear from people about. I just got reelected last fall, and as I was saying to Josh before we started, it was not an issue that I ever heard on the campaign trail until I got to a debate and the moderator raised it. So it's, people in most of New Hampshire seem to feel like it's working pretty well.
Well, and I have a little different take. It started out as a concept on the part of the governors, but then the federal government got involved with it, and really the concern that the parents have that I've talked to is that the federal government has become prescriptive in terms of not only setting standards but going beyond that. So again, it goes to that issue of federal control rather than giving states and local school districts and local school boards control. And that's why I don't support Common Core based on that concern, and why we work so hard in the legislation, and I think why we got a big vote in support of it, because the federal government cannot require or even incentivize states to implement Common Core. And the purpose is to make sure that you have that local control rather than a federal mandate.
So currently, the SAT and the ACT are really, and along with advanced placement and some other tests that are taken nationally, are really the only benchmarks for everyone in the country. Is there a benefit, would there be a benefit to a K through 12 benchmark of some kind that would allow the fine students in North Dakota to be compared with the fine students in New Hampshire?
So if you want, I'll start on this one.
We'll
unless you want me to defer, I'm always happy to defer to my esteemed colleague. That's a great question. And I think it's really important. So there's a difference, right? I understand a standardized test, SAT, ACT. I took both of them, even as old as I am, you know. And so I understand what you're saying, you know, some way to see how students are doing across the country. But that's different. That's different than having local schools and local school districts and teachers in the classroom determine how best to educate their students, whether they're in California or New York or New Hampshire or North Dakota, because there are differences, and we have to empower those teachers and empower those local school boards and those schools. So that's why I point out, with Every Child Achieves, I think we're going the right direction, because we say, hey, you still have to do testing, okay? But you figure out how to do the testing, and then you figure out how to respond to those test results in terms of educating your students and training your teachers. And how you do it in New York City is going to be different than how you do it in a rural state like mine. And so that's what we're after. And now, do you still have tests that students take, like the ACT and the SAT? Of course.
Senator?
Well, look, I think it's important to be able to measure what students are learning and how they're doing, and whether that's to compare them to the students in the next community or the students in the next state. All of that is important. I think what happened with No Child Left Behind is that we did too much teaching to the test. There was too much focus on that,
right,
and not enough focus on what kids were actually learning, which is why I'm excited about some of the initiatives that they're doing in New Hampshire, because it's trying to look at how else can we measure students' progress. Because the standardized test isn't the only way, and as we know, there are some kids who don't do well on standardized tests. So what else can we be using that will also show us how kids are doing?
And with NCLB, it was, again, kind of that one-size-fits-all federal standard, teaching to the test, and then, every school had to respond in a certain way or they didn't make their yearly progress. And so, again, it got to be a very regimented, federalized process and didn't allow for the tremendous differences that we have across the country. And it didn't really empower, not only our great teachers, but our administrators to really respond to the students that they're the closest to and have the best understanding in terms of how to teach them.
Great. Love to go to the audience for questions. Right back here.
And can we ask you to identify yourself and tell us what your connection is, where you're from?
I'm Lawrence Norris. I'm with the Arlington Science and Technology Alliance and the National Society of Black Physicists. Sir, with all due respect, I'm not convinced that local control is such a great virtue. Could you spend some more time explaining why a national education strategy is not a good idea?
I think local control is part of a good national strategy. And I'll give you an example, might relate to your field. I'm a big fan of STEM education, science, technology, engineering, and math. I worked and co-sponsored legislation with Senator Klobuchar of Minnesota to include provisions in Every Child Achieves that allows states to take formula grants and use them to start STEM education programs in the schools, starting even down in the middle school, and they can decide whether they want to make it a STEM school or just have a STEM curriculum within the school, so that for individuals who want to pursue the sciences, like you have, obviously, they have that opportunity. But there are other students that may want other opportunities. And so, again, I think that flexibility and local control is a vital part of a good national strategy.
Yeah, and I'm not sure that we should be thinking about it as an either-or, because, as I said, we believe in local control in New Hampshire, but I also think we need a strategy at the federal and at the state and at the local level that focuses on the importance of education, that recognizes that there are certain standards that should be in place in order to try and promote that learning, and that we should try and get everybody to buy into that, to a vision that says that. So I think, unfortunately, we've had a whole lot of debate around, it's either going to be the federal way or the state way or the local way or whatever. And what we ought to be trying to do is to get everybody to buy into how can we make sure that kids are learning, and what changes do we need to put in place to do that. And those may be different in New Hampshire than North Dakota. They may be different in Claremont in New Hampshire and Portsmouth in New Hampshire. But if we have certain standards that we're trying to achieve and ways of assessing how kids are doing to see if they're achieving those, then that ought to be the goal.
Any other questions? Right here. Thank you.
My name is Carol O'Donnell, and I'm the director of the Smithsonian Science Education Center. So at the beginning of the talk, Mae Jamison talked about the importance of hands-on science, students doing science, experiential science. Obviously, one of the best ways to assess that is through performance-based assessments. In New Hampshire, I know you talked about your pilot around PACE, which is really around competency-based assessment,
Right.
And we're starting to see that at the post-secondary level as well. Do you think it's possible that that model of assessment, competency-based assessment, performance-based assessment, could scale up across not just New Hampshire, but other places where standardized assessment does encompass performance-based or competency-based assessment?
Well, I hope so, and I think that's one of the things the pilot in New Hampshire is going to help show us. And you know, you talked about one of the things that we haven't touched a whole lot on, though Senator Hoeven talked about his work with Amy Klobuchar around STEM education. But one of the things that I think is really important to, and is included in the Every Child Achieves Act, is making sure that experiential education is also part of the options that school districts have. We have a program in New Hampshire called the First Robotics Competition that I think most states have. We've got about 100,000 students nationwide involved in that. It started in New Hampshire with a guy named Dean Kamen, the inventor of the insulin pump and the Segway. And kids are really excited to participate in that. And it's a way to get kids who may not get turned on to science and math or engineering in the classroom turned on because they're working with mentors, because they have this great robot that they're building and this contest that they're participating in. And part of what is in the Every Child Achieves Act are grants to help encourage school districts to look at that kind of experiential education as part of what they're doing as well. And so I think we've got to be open, not just to those different assessments, but also to what other ways can we engage kids in a way that gets them excited about what they're learning.
And along those lines, one of the issues that is talked a lot about in STEM education is the ability to attract girls into it, to produce more women. We've seen a lot of very interesting discussions even on Twitter about what an engineer looks like. What do you think are strategies that could close that gender gap?
Well,
I'll let you start that one.
There is a gender gap. I don't know if we have representatives of any of the big tech companies in the room, but you all know there's a gender gap in the tech industries, and we need to reach down into the lower grades. We need to start much earlier with getting young girls and young women excited about STEM subjects, and recognizing how successful they can be, so that some of the deterrents that as kids get into middle school that young women feel are no longer part of the classroom. I think we've got all kinds of good models for that. Project Lead the Way is one of those that I think is helpful if we can encourage young women to be involved. I talked about the First Robotics Competition, which is a place where if you can get teams to get young women engaged with those teams, that's another place to get girls excited. There's a wonderful documentary that's been done that explores the gender gap in the tech industries, that if you haven't seen it, I would encourage people watching it. We had a great showing in Congress a couple months ago of it, and the discussion with Megan Smith, who's the Chief Technology Officer for the country, was there, and the excitement about the prospect of changing that dynamic to get more young women into the STEM subjects was really exciting. We have 48% of our workforce are women, only 24% of STEM workers are women, and those are jobs that pay more. And one of the interesting things about it is the more women you get into those STEM jobs, the lower the salaries go. So it's like, unfortunately, so much of what we've seen in the job market as women enter fields that they haven't been in, instead of raising the pay scale often goes down. But this is an area that's really important, not just for women, but also for Hispanics and African Americans, because if we're going to be successful in getting the workforce that we need with the background in those subjects, we've got to engage not just women, but minority communities as well.
I think the language that Senator Klobuchar and I put in Every Child Achieves relating to STEM will be helpful not only in getting more students across the board involved in STEM education, but more women involved as well. And I think we're already seeing that. For example, in West Fargo, they're down in the middle school level with their STEM education. And when Senator Klobuchar and I made some school visits there, both at the middle school and at the high school level, I saw a lot of women in both the middle school and in the high school level. I'm not sure it was 50-50, but it was well above the percentages that you just cited. So I think this gives schools the opportunity to do exactly that, come up with creative ways to appeal to more students as well as more women students.
All right, one last question before we go to bring presidential politics back into this. Education is not typically something that's a hot issue in the presidential cycle. Do you think it will be in 2016, and should it be?
Yeah, education is vitally important. I mean, it's about our future, it's about our kids and their future. So it's a vitally important subject every time, whether it's the presidential or for Congress, or any time we're working on good public policy. It's absolutely a priority. It was a priority in my governorship. I'm sure it was a priority for you in your governorship. But let me just throw this out and then turn to my colleague. I think if we can pass education reauthorization, which I believe we can do before the end of the year, I think we will have really advanced the ball here. And it's really timely, given that the last time we reauthorized education was the No Child Left Behind. So I think to some extent we're going to take a big, big step here. But of course it remains a priority, yes.
I agree with what Senator Hoeven said about the importance of education and the importance of debating education. I think we're going to see it in this presidential campaign, certainly on the Republican side in terms of Common Core. It's already come up. You pointed that out. And that will continue to be an issue, I think. But look, we can't talk about the future economy of this country and what we've got to do to raise the opportunities for middle-class Americans, about how we stay competitive, without talking about education, without talking about how we need to make sure that all of our schools are performing well, that our young people are getting the skills they need to be part of the workforce. So it better be part of this presidential debate because it's critical to our future.